Good evening. Hello, I'm Jennifer Steinhauer. I'm editor of live journalism for the New York Times. It's my pleasure to be with all of you tonight to talk about one of the most pressing and at times underappreciated policy issues of our time. I would like to give a special welcome to New York Times subscribers and thank you for helping make our journalism happen. This evening's discussion has been brought to you by the New York Times Subscriber Events Program, which brings our readers behind the scenes at the New York Times. Those born right after September 11th terrorist attacks are now eligible to enlist, marking an official generation of our nation at war. What's been the outcome for those who have and are serving, and how is our nation grappling? Tonight, we bring to the stage New York Times journalists and experts on veteran issues to shine the light on some of it. Senator Tammy Duckworth is an Iraq War veteran, among the first Army women to fly combat missions during Operation Iraqi Freedom, after which she was awarded the Purple Heart. Bonnie Carroll, also a veteran, is founder of Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, which supports those impacted by the death of a family of a military loved one, and a 2015 recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Our own Chris Chivers, a Marine Corps infantry veteran of the Persian Gulf War, is an investigative reporter who won a Pulitzer Prize for his piece on an Afghan war veteran suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Here to moderate this discussion is someone who knows all these issues very well. He's Eric Schmidt, who's covered national security issues for the New York Times for decades and has twice shared a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage. So please join me now in welcoming my colleagues Eric Schmidt and Chris Chivers and Bonnie Carroll and Senator Tammy Duckworth.
Well, good evening. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. I think we've got a great panel here for a discussion for the next hour or so. And we'll have some time for questions at the end, and I'll let you all know when that time comes. But I'm going to ask Chris Chivers, my colleague at the Times, to start us off in talking about wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, in which 2.7 million Americans have served since 2001. Nearly 7,000 have died, and tens of thousands have been injured. And Chris has written a remarkable book, The Fighters, which I highly recommend. It's just out. And in this remarkable book, Chris has several remarkable stories of individuals. And Chris, I'd like you to kind of start us off and talk about one of the characters. It's toward the end of the book, a guy named Doc Kirby. Tell us a little bit about him and how he may be emblematic of some of the themes we're going to be talking about tonight.
So the ambition of the book, and the ambition really of most of my work at the Times, is trying to cover the lower level experience of war and of combat. And in this character, Doc Kirby, we selected him to be profiled at length because he carries with him so many of the burdens that some of the younger members of the rank and file over the last near 20 years now have suffered. So he was a corpsman. For those of you who aren't fluent in military speak, it means he was basically a trauma medic in the Navy, assigned to a Marine infantry unit. And he, in his 5th month, after saving several people who were wounded, he himself was wounded. He was shot through the face by a sniper in one side of the jaw and out the other, taking with it some teeth, part of his jaw, part of his tongue. And he began a journey now, it's 12 years on, of more than 30 surgeries and dealing with moral injury, some doubts he had about people he saved, a particular person he'd saved who'd suffered a traumatic brain injury, and he wondered how he was going to fare in his life. He dealt with his own PTSD, and he dealt with grueling pain that led to alcohol abuse and relationship difficulties. And he finally, after about a dozen years, is doing much better. And I chose Doc to talk about because in many ways he bundled, in a very acute fashion, a lot of the difficulties that people coming home carry with them.
Senator, I'd love to have you talk a little bit about your personal journey. Chris has been a chronicler of soldiers, Marines, airmen, sailors, and all. But you have a personal story I wish you could kind of walk us through and how you got to be where you are in the United States Senate today.
Well, it was never anything I intended to get into politics. I was just a helicopter pilot and very happy in what I was doing and very fulfilled and loved it. And one day I got hit by an RPG and I should have died in that field in Iraq, and my buddies saved me. They got me to help within about 20 minutes. And they carried what they thought was my corpse out of the field and got me to help. And my crew chief, Sergeant Fierce, which is an amazing name for an Army NCO, Sergeant Fierce, who almost lost his leg, he sat behind me in the helicopter with a tourniquet on, had the presence of mind on the deck of that aircraft, that rescue bird, to realize that I was still bleeding because the deck of the aircraft kept getting wetter and wetter, and he realized, oh shit, her heart's still beating. And when the medics came to evacuate him, said, no, you take care of Captain Duckworth first. I think she's still alive, and that's the first help that I got. And so that's why I'm here today. And so every day I wake up, from the minute that I woke up at Walter Reed, trying to repay that debt.
And how did you get into politics, though? From that hospital bed, how do you make that transition?
I happened to be the highest ranking amputee at Walter Reed. I had found out 3 days before I was wounded that I was going to be pinning on my 04. I was going to be a major. I'd been out on the majors list for a while and wasn't going to, because the irony of the military, because I was deployed, I wasn't in an 04 slot, so I couldn't get promoted because somebody back home, safe at home, was sitting in a slot so that they could get promoted, but while I was out there, in combat, I couldn't get promoted. But they said they found a slot, they're gonna get me promoted, and 3 days later I got hit. So I woke up the highest ranking amputee at Walter Reed for I was there about 6 months, maybe 8 months, I was the highest ranking. And I just started advocating for other amputees and other patients there because there was just a lot of stuff that was messed up at Walter Reed in that time. The healthcare was above the best. The doctors, the nurses, the clinicians were amazing folks, but it was stupid stuff like a kid was unconscious for 8 months and Army pay was paying him hostile fire pay and combat pay. By the way, you get an extra $200 for getting shot at per month. So if you want to make a lot of money, that's a good way to do it. So this kid was some private, and then the Army figured this out. Some bean counter somewhere figured this out and took it all back. And his wife was 19 years old with an 8-month-old baby, was crying at Walter Reed because she'd missed 3 payments on the trailer they had at Fort Hood and had no more diapers and was running out of money for formula and didn't know what to do. And so my husband, who also served, and I just said, wait, we got a little more years on us. Let us walk you through the accounting system. Let's fix this. And then we just started taking care of each other. And the NCOs who were wounded started taking care of each other as well. And so we just started watching out for each other while we were there. And in fact, I think there's somebody here in the audience, Daniel Gade, now Dr. Daniel Gade, who was there at the same time. How you doing, man? He knows, he was there at the same time. He's a leg amputee. I don't know if I should have said that. HIPAA. Yeah, if you see him walking, you'll know. But we always just watching out for each other and taking care of each other. And I met then Senator Dick Durbin and Senator Barack Obama, who had just been elected and was on the Veterans Affairs Committee because nobody wanted to be on the VA committee. And he was this young junior senator, and nobody who knew who this guy with the crazy name was. And I just started calling my senators. And after about 9 months, Dick Durbin called me up and said, you need to run for Congress if you think that we're not doing right by veterans. And that's how I got here.
That's terrific.
Yeah.
Well, Bonnie, tonight we're focused on, of course, on veterans coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, but you've been at this a lot longer. Your organization's been around about 25 years. Mm-hmm. Talk about the evolution of how that's changed. You were probably getting a lot of Vietnam vets early on, and now obviously dealing with maybe a different kind of veteran. I don't know. Talk a little bit about what your organization is doing and how things are changing, the evolution of that.
Yeah, well, my father-in-law was a World War II veteran, and he actually was killed at the end of his career when he was the Adjutant General of Alaska. He was killed in a C-123 crash when my husband and his 3 brothers were just teenagers. So my husband grew up in a home that was basically a Gold Star family. And as soon as he and his brothers graduated from high school, 3 of them joined the military, and they went off to Vietnam. So my husband served several tours of Vietnam, came back a decorated combat veteran, and had a fantastic career in the Army. But at the end of his career, he came back home to Alaska, became the Assistant Adjutant General of the Alaska Army National Guard, We had great things planned for our future, and we're just enjoying this wonderful life when he was killed in a C-12 crash with 7 other soldiers on board. So at the time I was a reservist. I was serving in the Alaska Air National Guard. Had lost 2 of my fellow airmen, 1 to suicide and 1 to a heart attack. Had been on a critical incident stress debriefing team, was involved in my community doing work with victims of violent crime. So when Tom was killed, I thought, well, how convenient. I've had this training, I've had this experience, I know the military, I'll be able to cope. And that little fantasy lasted about 30 seconds, and life just stopped. And dealing with the death of a partner, no matter where that loss occurs, is absolutely devastating for the entire family. So I went looking for the kind of support that I knew, this is America. We have a support group for everything. And I knew about some of the other support systems that were out there, went looking for it, went to the one for police officers, but they weren't speaking my language, went to the one, hospice groups, and the one I knew for victims of violent crime. Nobody was speaking my language. And so after about 2 years of just trying to catch my breath and find my way and put one foot in front of the other, really started digging in and looking for where those gaps were. Was it really possible that we didn't have a place for all those grieving the death of a military loved one to come together, to find a community, to find resources, hope, healing, and just to know that they're not alone? So launched TAPS in October of 1994, and we're coming up on our 25th anniversary now. We have over 80,000 surviving family members, and we're taking in an average now of 17 per day, about over 6,000 this year. So it is America's family of those who have given the ultimate price for our freedom.
And do you see a difference between the veterans that you're seeing today versus those that were starting, even as a new organization, obviously, but at the time?
It's a wonderful thing about our organization is grief is a wonderful equalizer. And it really is about the life and the service, not just the moment and the manner of the death. So when our families come together, it's a mom talking to a mom about a little boy that grew up and dreamed of being in the military. Or when it's a widow talking to another widow, it's the love story of how they met and the dreams that they had. It isn't about that moment and manner of death, whether it was a suicide or a motorcycle accident or hostile action. Of course, our numbers have changed dramatically since the wars, but it is that family that comes together and helps each other heal.
Chris, the New York Times did something unusual this past weekend. Maybe some of you saw it, a special section called Those Who Can't Forget. It's about Section 60, which is a special section at Arlington National Cemetery. Talk a little bit about the impetus for this special section and the At War channel, which is run by Lauren Katzenberg.
Who's here somewhere.
Yeah, hi, Lauren. Yeah.
All right.
And talk a little bit about that, some of the themes that we've been picking up on.
So At War began several years ago as a blog on the New York Times. And it was kind of co-managed by the foreign and international desks. And then it ended as the troop drawdowns in Iraq and Afghanistan took shape. And it was always pretty contrarian. It had an organizing idea that was unstated but palpable, that this is for the rank and file, that the bosses, the people who run the military, are connected to all sorts of instruments of expression. They have more public affairs channels than probably any organization on earth. But the rank and file is relatively unheard from, even silenced. And we took submissions from the field, from soldiers, and we wrote from the field, from the lower rank, with our reporting staff on the foreign and national desks. And we created a pretty vibrant community over several years, and then it abruptly came to an end. Last year, we decided to start it again, and we hired Lauren. We frankly poached her from Task and Purpose, where she was thriving with a startup that covered many of the issues that interested us. And this program really, or not this program, this special section, really we should thank Bonnie, because she was instrumental in helping us identify, her organization and her staff, identifying families. And Lauren, when we hired Lauren, one of her ideas was to do a project about Section 60. She's had this in mind probably for years, but we've known about it for about a year.
And Section 60, for the audience, is what?
So Arlington is more than 600 acres, and Section 60 is a 14-acre patch. And it's an active burial site, so veterans are, and there are several active burial sites at Arlington, but many of the veterans who have died in the so-called global war of terror, on terror since 2001, have been interred at Section 60. So it serves as this small patch of earth where there's a concentration of recent losses in combat or in accidents overseas. And it's almost like the geography of the wars is scratched into the ground there. Like you can follow it in a near chronological fashion. And you can see the early invasion and occupation in Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, the long occupation of Iraq, and then major mishaps or operations, major aircraft accidents, they're all there. And so that's what you see if like you went there at sunrise and you were alone. But what you really see there is a sense of community. I mean, Arlington, if you look at it, many of the fields are almost silent because they hold veterans who were killed generations ago and they have no surviving family members who actually knew them. But Section 60 is absolutely crowded with lovers and spouses and children and parents and the unit members themselves. So if you're at one grave, you may find 6 or 7 vets in baseball caps, like doing shots around the grave. And in another, you may find a widow or a widower, or another, you may find a child leaving letters to his parents. It's an incredibly touching and very singular place.
I hear you all talking about a community of veterans and how that's evolved. Senator, you talked about how you got involved in politics through trying to help others. Obviously, we have midterm elections coming up very soon. There are more and more veterans are running. You must hear from many of them and counsel them, whether at the national level or state and local levels. What do you say from your own experience? And what was it like running, kind of coming right out of the hospital, really, in many ways? And how do you think this generation of veterans may impact policies around in this country?
So I think some of them have already started impacting policies. What I say to all of them is run, 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 run. I don't care if you run as a Republican, as a Democrat. If you run as a Democrat, I will help you. If you want to run as a Republican, I will put you into contact with the right people so that you can run on the Republican side. I will help you run because we don't have the veterans with the combat experience the way we did when the Vietnam generation was still in Congress in large numbers. And so you have this disconnect between not just the American people and those who go and bleed and suffer and sacrifice over and over and over again. You have a disconnect between those who are sitting in the halls of power and the people we send off to war, so that my colleagues and I can be complicit in this avoidance of war and avoidance of making the tough decisions of the AUMF, the authorization for use of military force. We can hide from this and avoid having these votes and just have this endless war that just keeps on going and going. And once we get more veterans who show up, you get things that happen like, a good example is Maxine Waters has put in an amendment over and over again to sunset the existing authorizations for use of military force that were passed in 2001 and 2003 that basically authorized us to go to war, and we're still operating on those. And she's put this in time and time again as a liberal Democrat, and it never got anywhere. Well, guess what? It recently passed, and it passed because there are now Republicans, members who are veterans who spoke up for it, and it passed. I was able to push a certain piece of legislation because there were Republicans of my generation who have been elected on the other side of the aisle, and we were able to work together and pass some of this. So I tell them, run and make a difference. I don't care where you run and get in there, because until that happens, there will continue to be this widening gap and disconnect between the American people and the people who serve and sacrifice over and over again. And not only is that a shirking of responsibility on the politicians' part, it's a shirking of moral responsibility on our part and on the American public.
Chris, did you want to add something?
Can I yield all my time to the senator from Illinois? You're singing my song.
This is why I tell folks to run, because until we get more people there, nobody gets it. Nobody gets what it's like over there.
Bonnie, do you see that in your work? Are this new generation, you're starting to see more veterans coming into, whether it's the state legislatures or on the national level, and how is that impacting the care and policies that are affecting not just the survivors, but the families too? Talk a little bit about that.
Oh my God, absolutely. And our families do become advocates. And we're very, very fortunate to have family members who have lost loved ones who speak out and make changes. Ashlyn Haycock lost her dad in 2002 and grew up in our Taps Good Grief camp. And then when she was a sophomore at American University, she lost her mother, who was an Air Force veteran, to suicide. Well, she had a very difficult time then going back into the college system because now she had no parents to co-sign with her. So a lot of her financial aid structure changed, her benefits changed. It was a real challenge. And she said, I've got TAPS to help me, and I've got a community around me, and we were able to get her through it. But she said, I want to make a difference for the other kids. And she has now become an incredible champion for change. She was instrumental in the latest round of the GI Bill. She was able to create an education portal that allows every single child who's lost a loved one, a dad in the military, to get a free and unlimited education. That's through the federal benefits, through the state waivers. 45 out of 50 states waive tuition for surviving kids, and very few people know that. And then rounded out with the scholarships, the private scholarships. So she's just one example of a surviving family member who gave the ultimate price for this country, losing both parents. And now she's making a tremendous difference, and she is on Capitol Hill every day.
But
yeah.
Picking up on the senator's comment, are there specific pieces of legislation that you all feel need to be passed, whether it's by this Congress or in the upcoming Congress?
Well, we're very, very grateful for the recent passing of the Senate resolution to designate this week as Gold Star Mothers and Families Week. So thank you very much for that.
Chris, talk a little bit about your experience in covering these veterans and going back and retelling some of their stories. And what you learned is obviously a veteran war correspondent. You've probably seen some of this, but as you sit down to write, kind of pulling together 17 years worth of reporting, really, over the last couple of years, what are some of the things that you took away, maybe even surprised you as you kind of trying to make sense of this?
Well, for years I paid principally attention to field reporting. So I was basically covering the infantry or infantry-like units or the medevac units that supported them, and that's almost all I did exclusively. I mean, the New York Times is a big, complicated organization, and we have a lot of reporters who cover war from a lot of different perspectives and applying a lot of different lenses. So I never paid hardly any attention to the generals or to the politicians. I mostly just went low and low and as low as I could down to the specialists and the warrant officers and the captains and the sergeants who actually fight the wars. And it became very consuming and in some ways kind of stunting and blinding, because I would come home for a while and then I'd go back out with another unit and went out for years just racking up patrols, trying to, I guess, experientially absorb the wars on a social and tactical level. And it wasn't until I came home and stopped doing this that I realized I'd really missed a huge part of the story, which was what was going on here and the people coming home, and that a veteran doesn't go to war, the whole family goes to war. And the whole family suffers things that I had, in some ways, shamefully not even thought of, because I was using all my bandwidth to keep up with the field time. And when I came home and then reconnected with all these people who I'd met across, more than a decade, something like 15 years, and started to track them down and go see them and socialize with them and work professionally with them as a journalist and get to know their families, I saw an extraordinary sort of isolation from the larger population. These people I knew were part of 1% or less of the country who went to the wars. I mean, they have no real political clout. Organically in our system, they're just too small a number. And they suffered in ways that were common and palpable, but often very private. And since coming home, I've tried to engage at a different level and understand these wars and their costs on our country in a more three-dimensional way. And to answer your question, the most surprising thing for me, because many times the way people got through the war itself was through personal toughness and camaraderie, by being very competent and being with other people who are very competent and making selfless and smart decisions day in and day out, and they'd get through their tours, and then they'd come home and they need something else to be integrated back into life, which is a sense of community and love. And I hadn't really seen that over there, that the thing that the people I know who've done well coming home have found love somewhere, whether it's in their CrossFit gym or their church or their family. They all have a sense of community. Those who I know who are thriving have found community, or maybe it's TAPS, which connects people to something larger, because it's very easy to kind of sit in your juice and spin and relive your tour or your time in your head. And it takes, to come home, it really takes a larger community.
Are we telling the story well enough? I mean, Chris has kind of taken a shot at it, obviously, in this book and through his reporting, but how do you view the media? And obviously the media is very under fire right now, and in terms of whether it's veracity or not, and whether it's coming from.
No, I think
what more can we be doing?
I think Chris is telling the story. I wish more people would read the things that he's written, because I think it really gets to what actually is happening with these families and these men and women that sacrifice. And when I'll tell people, I know people who've deployed 7 times, and people are like, what do you mean 7 times? Yeah, I know people who've deployed 7 times, 8 times. And they're folks who come home and they can't handle being home, so they volunteer and they keep going back and they keep going back. And after a while, they can't go back in uniforms, and then they go back as contractors. And they find other ways to keep going, and they become these junkies. And I've had staffers that I tried to bring on and would work for me, for a little bit, and they're like, no, and they volunteer, and then they go do something else. And so, yeah, I think what Chris is doing is really important. I think that there's just this real disconnect. Americans just don't know what's happening, and they don't know that we're on this endless road to nowhere. It's almost like this circular loop of this war that we just keep going around in circle and circle and circle, and we keep asking this, and it's the same families so often that keep going and going, and then dad retires, or something happens, and then dad kills himself or something, and then a cousin or a nephew to memorialize him goes and enlists, and then it just keeps going, and there's no end in sight to these for these wars, and nobody's holding. If there's anything that media is not doing, it's not holding people like me accountable. We've not gone anywhere near the pressure that we should have to do something about these AUMF and make a decision on when does the war end, what is the conditions, what are you doing? Why are you not focused on this? We've spent more time debating whether or not people should kneel during the national anthem than we have about when does the war in Afghanistan end.
So what do your colleagues say when you have this kind of discussion with them in the private chambers of the Senate?
Oh, I mean, I've had these discussions on the floor. I've given floor speeches on this. Some get it. Some want to do something. And this is why I try to, again, get more people to get elected into office. And as more veterans show up who are veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, more get it. I've been working a lot with Ruben Gallego, who's a House member, who is a specialist Marine, a breed in themselves. A specialist in the Marine, he's your very typical Speedy 4 that you get something done, but don't ask him how he did it, because you want possible deniability when he accomplishes whatever it is you tell him to do. But now he's a member of Congress, and he and I have been really pushing hard on this. And so, but many of them don't want to hear, because they don't want to have this vote. They don't want to be on the record, and they'd rather just shirk that responsibility. And this happened under President Obama as well as under Bush administration and now the Trump administration.
Bonnie, do you see this in the people who come to your organization? I mean, this endless circle the Senator's talking about. And what do you tell them, and how do you engage with them in trying to break out of this, if there is a way out?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we're doing now is actually engaging with many of our fellow partner nations who have programs for surviving families as well. And where there are countries that don't have a program, we've helped stand one up. So we have one in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and we have surviving families who are talking to the widows and the children there. Because we have to give meaning and purpose to the life, the service, and the death of our loved ones. So I was back in Mosul, Iraq, with a group of our surviving families last August, when they finally were able to take down the ISIS flag and for the first time raise the Iraqi flag. And it was an incredibly powerful moment to have a young widow who lost her Special Forces fiancé 10 years to the day stand there with other young women who had also lost their loved ones and just say, we are going to make sure the next generation grows up in a stable society. We're going to draw the line, and we are going to be intolerant of violent extremism, and it's going to start with us. So what we can do from our family perspective is make a difference, is do what we can in the world to continue that and be that living legacy.
What does that mean in a practical term, and how can people here in the audience maybe get involved or help if they want to?
Well, in every one of the countries, we have a program that will help these women and these children have a sustainable future, be economically self-sustainable, get an education. In Afghanistan, it's the Lapis. Fawzia Kufi, who is a member of parliament from Badakhshan, actually helped us mine, or have access to mining the best lapis in the world. And it's a woman-owned gemstone company that then takes the lapis and turns it into the beads. So widows of Afghanistan, the Afghan National Security and Defense Forces, who make the bracelets and do these silk knots. And then it's our surviving families who then sell them to raise money for our organization. So it's all coming together to help each other. We had an international working group this summer, and we brought together 27 different nations. It was from India, Colombia, South America, Nigeria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Australia, and committing to standing firm against violent extremism and to help this next generation grow up in a better future. It's all we can do.
I want to come back to something you all have been saying in slightly different ways, but it's that notion that you have veterans, this small, relatively small, the American population of military veterans are out there, and then this disconnect, as one of you things said. Help me understand how we got there and how we maybe get beyond that right now, and either enlarge that understanding or address some of these issues a little bit more effectively. Who would like to?
Well, I mean, we got there with the start of the elimination of the draft. I don't support reinstatement of the draft, but we don't have a mandatory national service law that says that every young person in this country should serve the nation in some way.
Should we?
I've written a bill that makes it voluntary, but that there's an opportunity for every young person when they turn 18 to serve the nation. And the acceptance rate into programs like AmeriCorps and certain programs is almost as high or is even more restrictive than Ivy League universities. So most young Americans do not serve. They don't go out of their comfort zone, and they don't go and see people in other areas. As opposed to the draft generation, where you could end up in a fighting position next to someone from a completely different background than yours. And the loss was more uniformly spread out. I mean, the rich, it's no secret that I call current President Cadet Bonesburrs. He is a 5 deferment draft dodger that the rich can get out of it if they need to, but it was more universal. The service, the understanding was more universal. And now you don't have that. And now it's military families, people who are trying to get out of, for some families in Black and brown communities, it's one of the few ways out of poverty. And so you really do have this disconnect where most American people have not served, don't know anything beyond the Hollywood description. Don't bother to try to learn.
Chris, have you come across any ways that you see this, maybe where this divide can be bridged?
Well, I'm going to echo the senator again. I mean, the draft, I was compelled to join the Marine Corps after the 1983 bombing at the barracks in Beirut, in which 241 Marines and sailors were killed. And I was actually going through my first training in 1985. And some of my training staff, like the drill instructors and the senior officers, and then when I got out to my first infantry unit, some of the senior NCOs had been to Vietnam. And they told us all, you guys are so lucky we don't have the draft, because it was really hard to run this outfit when, you know, it was third or 20% of the people didn't want to be here. And between that and your analysis, which, you know, a lot of the older NCOs used to tell me we were all stoned for years, and we're not anymore, and we have volunteers, and so the service now runs so much more efficiently. And it was so much, it's so socially acceptable now to be in the military, and it's just a different climate than what they had in the late 60s and 70s when some of my older peers had come in. And that was like Kool-Aid for me. I believed this. Now I find, as I'm in my 50s and having watched the all-volunteer military, the all-volunteer force, fight 2 wars for almost 20 years, and have such little attention from, you know, back home to here in this island nation, I've come around to thinking if we had a mail lottery that filled part of the force. I had dinner with the 3 veterans last night from Afghanistan, and one of them said it was kind of like a pilot program. Even if we only drafted 1,000 people a year with no deferments, 1,000 people, everyone in the country would have to pay attention. They'd have to wonder, like, is my niece or nephew, or my son or daughter or my grandchild going to be pulled into this? And I'll bet, Senator, then we'd have a real conversation about the AUMF.
Yeah, you would have more protests. You don't have any protests on that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I say this a lot at public events. You know, if we had a draft, you know, Jim Mattis, it wouldn't be enough to use one-liners like Chuck Norris and become a Facebook meme. You know, you would actually have to have a strategy that you could articulate and that we scrutinized.
Bonnie?
You know, I enlisted in the Air National Guard back in you know, peacetime, and at the time I had a great career going, working on Capitol Hill. And when I told the team that I was working with that I had done that and I'd be gone for 6 months to basic training, they said, "Why in the world would you do that? Have you lost your mind?" Well, my mother had served. She was a pilot in World War II, and she really inspired me to do this, and I wanted to serve. And I said to them, I said, it's the duty of every American to serve if they're able.
And you make a good point, because even if we were to have a draft, and even when we did have a draft, there were a lot of volunteers. There were Americans who are going to show up and fight their way to the front of the line, and if they have flat feet, they're going to get someone else to take the physical. I mean, my father-in-law is one of those guys. He was underweight, and there was a guy in South Boston who took everyone's physical. That guy went to MEPS and took it physical, and Jackie went into the Navy for a few years. Yeah. And there were people like Jackie who are always going to show up and want to do it. And if we were drafting, though, some percentage of what was left, I think we'd have a different national conversation than we have now.
Well, you look at public opinion polls, and sadly a lot of institutions, some of which we belong to, are sagging in polls. The military is one of the few that is either held even or is increasing in the last few years. And yet, so that's one kind of standard, and yet the Army just announced in this last week, I believe, that they've missed their recruiting goals for this year, the first time in over a decade. And I'm wondering what that says. Is some of this dissonance or kind of seeping through to the next generation of soldiers? And I know the Army said, well, it's because of a strong economy, there's other options that these kids have, or there's just a shrinking pool of eligible recruits. But I'm just wondering if some of what you've all been talking about tonight is starting to kind of sink in. Now, the other services did make their goals, but the Army came up a little bit short. At least it looks like it will. But
I think it's a combination of things. I think it's the economy, but also the Pentagon put out a study, I think it's been 24 months now, that showed that they can only recruit from about 29% of the potential population, because over 70% of the young people in this country cannot pass the basic physical, cannot get in because they can't pass the math or the English tests. and because all military manuals are written at the 6th grade level. They can't pass a physical because of a childhood condition due to untreated lack of access to health care, like childhood asthma, or a drug problem, opioid addiction, or a felony conviction. And that actually takes 3/4 of the population of the young people out of the potential for them to recruit from. So they're already recruiting from just a quarter. And then when everything else happens, that's where you get. But also, a lot of parents just never think of, or they think you can do better than to go enlist in the military. Except for those families that are either poor or come from a military background. Then it's an honorable thing.
Bonnie, do you see that with the families that you serve? I mean, are they looking and saying, boy, that's not the decision, that's not the place where I want my son or daughter or grandson or granddaughter to be going at this point?
Well, it's interesting. Senator Duckworth mentioned earlier that many of the families, actually, the younger siblings will go in the military to kind of honor their fallen and kind of live out that legacy. We have a wonderful program for our military mentors that we bring in to volunteer with a Good Grief Camp. And we give service members and veterans an opportunity to volunteer for a weekend at a camp with a surviving child in a group setting. And a lot of them think, oh, it's just babysitting and we're just going to be there with the kids. But when they get there, they really have an opportunity to take off the uniform, put on the mentor shirt, be there with all of their battle buddies, and be there for someone else. But kids are just so honest and really open up about their losses and their struggles. And we find that then our military members and veterans also open up and have the chance to really share in a safe setting. And that gives these kids an insight into the military that they wouldn't otherwise have, and a connection back to who their dad or their mom was. And it also gives our service members a connection into those that they have lost. So it is that continuity, and I think it's a different window into our military today.
Chris, you were mentioning kind of the Vietnam War veterans, some of whom you served with and were kind of your mentors. And you write in your book that the post-war experience for this generation coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan is different from those vets, and what the kind of reception they got back here in the United States. But you talk about today's vets confronting something pernicious but usually invisible. Talk a little bit more about what you meant by that.
Well, they come home to a country that's almost unaware that they even served overseas. It just wasn't paying attention. It's very different.
Even with all the media coverage that you have, I mean, the ability of reporters.
The media coverage is there, but those of us who look at it closely know that it doesn't get the same traffic as a lot of other things that are available every day in the media diet. It's just not as closely followed. And so when people came home from Vietnam, it was interesting, I was editing a story today that has to do with some Vietnam vets looking back on their time in Hue City in 1968. And they came home and were spat upon or challenged in follow-on job interviews about, did you kill babies and the like. And they faced the scrutiny that was excruciating from the populace generally. People come home now and I think they're widely respected and generally ignored. And so they come home to a lot of gestures that feel hollow. The yellow ribbons, the free tickets to Fenway one day a year, sort of a ritualized worship that doesn't amount to much practically. And those who are struggling often struggle alone, even though you won't see, like we used to see, them facing incredible social penalty for being in the military. They also don't really feel understood in many cases. And that's what I meant by that. And I see this in my own family, because my dad's a Vietnam vet, and then I was a Gulf War vet, and I spent all these years going back to Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere, often with our troops, or people who were working with our troops. And when I would come back home, I'd be gone sometimes up to 6 months or 4 months, but more likely like a long run of weeks, maybe 6 weeks or 2 months or a month. And I'd come back home, and air travel's so fast now, you could be in a really intense situation with a unit like on Monday, and on Friday be standing at the JFK passport line and with a bunch of people in like Hawaiian shirts and flip-flops who are coming up from their vacations in the Caribbean, and they have no, your ears may still be ringing, and they have no connection to all the other people who are passing in and out of the country from the military or from the contractors who are serving. And it's kind of like you're separate people. Even when you herd through the same passport control line, you're like a whole separate population with a separate set of experiences.
Senator, you're nodding. What, you experienced this yourself, or do you hear this from your constituents?
No, I remember when I came home for my 2 weeks leave, and I went back, and then I was hit not long after.
And this is 2004,
2000. And I came home, and on my 2 weeks leave, I remember going through the Atlanta airport, and I've been in a world where it was all shades of brown and beige, and I was in this airport, and it was just bright. I almost went through a sense of vertigo. Everybody was moving fast with a cell phone up to their ear, and it was just, everybody was talking, and I was just like, and I was just a helicopter pilot. I was on the front lines, like the guys who were in hell every single day. You know, I lived on a giant base with a swimming pool, and I went outside of the wire maybe twice. You know, I wasn't going to the bathroom in a piss tube, and I wasn't, I didn't have it rough. I had it pretty nice, and I went through this, so I can only imagine what it was like for the guys out there in the FOBs and what it was like. And I would fly into the FOBs and bring supplies to these guys and trying to get some of them out. And if I went, it literally was almost a sense of vertigo standing in that airport with all this going on, and I just froze for a little bit. But it was a very physical reaction.
But as these wars continue, as you all have explained, and the actual footprint, the size of American forces shrinks down to, we're now around 14,000, 15,000 in Afghanistan, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 in Iraq. It must be even more pronounced for those veterans coming back now. I mean, it's right. Like, well, people have moved on. Do you hear that from
Yeah, this is why they volunteer to go back, because that's comfort.
Coming home is not comfort. It's too
right. It's
too jarring.
You're by yourself. It's jarring. Nobody gets it. And over there, you got your brothers. You got your brothers and your sisters next to you. And in many ways, my life in combat was simple. Get up, do my job, stay alive, keep my buddies alive, hit the rack, do it again tomorrow. That was simple.
So each of you, I'd like to spin out for me, what does this generation of veterans look like 5, 10, 15 years from now? Are the services in place? We can talk a little bit about the VA system now. They have a new secretary. It's been a lot of turmoil this year at the VA. Talk a little bit about the care that is received, both physical care, mental care, other kind of things, both from the government and from organizations like TAPS. But also help us understand, what are you concerned about? What are you encouraged about as you see the signs that are either troubling or discouraging, looking out over how this generation is going to play out, this very large cohort of veterans who have been serving and coming home to this description you've just given us. Bonnie, you want to start?
Well, sure. Dr. Linda Davis, who is absolutely brilliant, has had a distinguished career, was brought on to the Department of Veterans Affairs as the Chief Veteran Experience Officer. And
Veterans Experience Officer?
Yes, it's a new position, and it's exciting. So
what does that mean?
It means that they're really looking at the experience of the veteran coming back, and what is the process like for the family, for the caregiver, for the whole family. I serve with Senator Elizabeth Dole on the VA Advisory Committee on Families, Caregivers, and Survivors. There are so many new initiatives, and we're trying. I see a tremendous effort being made, and I hope it does trickle down, and I hope it does have the impact that's intended.
Mm-hmm. Chris, what?
Well, I'm the skeptic and the pessimist. So
I'm shocked.
I see a lot of populations within the larger rubric of veterans who have, futures that look very uncertain to me. The burn pit population, how does this play out? The TBI population, what will aging look like for all the people who suffered? I mean, are we looking at early onset dementia and Alzheimer's or other diagnoses? the widow population and the widower population and the benefits that they receive that encourage them not to remarry. I mean, we have all of these, I mean,
Wait,
think
how
of them.
how does that work?
That you can lose your benefit if you marry again. So some choose because they have to support children.
So if you were to remarry, go on, hopefully get on with your life, there's going to be a financial penalty?
Yes. Yeah. So I see a lot of these populations moving forward with an uncertain future, and I don't know what the medical care will look like for them, or the legislation, or the support. And I'm, naturally pretty worried about it because they're a large population. They don't have a lot of political clout, and oftentimes they're isolated. And those with the most intense problems, if they don't have good family support, maybe won't get connected to services. So I think, as a journalist and as a citizen, I think these are things I'll be thinking on and pursuing for the rest of my days, because it doesn't feel like we're, as a society, engaged.
Before I turn to Senator Duckworth to get her thoughts on this, I just want to let you all know I'd like to turn to the audience in just a few minutes for your questions. And so if you'd like to start lining up, we're going to have mics on either side here. And I will turn to your questions shortly. So start thinking of some good ones for our panelists here. Senator, are you as discouraged as Chris is, or is there?
I'm worried, and it's why I do what I do. I'm worried, and it's why I do what I do, because when we talked about the cost of war, we think in terms of the cost of bullets and bombs and fighter jets and helicopters. We don't think about taking the need to care for these veterans for the rest of their natural lives. And you have to understand that the VA is absolutely overwhelmed. The VA is dealing with the Korean War generation, who are living longer lives than any veteran generation has ever lived. So now they're dealing with extreme geriatric care. They're dealing with the Vietnam population, which is now entering into a stage of their lives where exposure to Agent Orange is now causing certain illnesses that are just now manifesting themselves 50 years later: leukemia, hairy cell leukemia, B, ischemic heart disease, much higher rates of prostate cancer than the general male population, much higher rates of diabetes. You got the Gulf War veterans who are still undiagnosed, those things are still continuing to fester and grow. You're talking about Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who are just at the forefront of the care. Many of them are just now coming to VA to access care 10 years after they first served, because it took them that long to come to trust the government or bring themselves forward, many of them. And then you've got all these female veterans. There's a double the rates of infertility among female veterans than the general female population. So there are all of these things that are hitting VA all at once. At the same time, there's a real move to try to privatize VA, to say to a veteran, here's your VA ID card. Just go to whoever you want and we'll pay the bill. Except it doesn't work that way. You get a guy who's in his 60s who goes to the doctor and he gets diagnosed with diabetes. He'll get great care for that diabetes, but that's it. That same guy goes to VA, they'll be like, oh, were you boots on the ground in Vietnam? Yes, okay, let's check you for ischemic heart disease, leukemia B, let's figure out all of these other things, and let's take care of you as a person. And so privatization of VA loses the expertise of the VA, and yet the VA has nowhere near the number of mental health counselors it needs. It certainly does not have enough female healthcare providers and female mental health providers. It does not have enough outreach folks. It is under siege, and the people who are there work very hard. 30% of them are veterans, and they try to do everything that they can, but it is this giant bureaucracy that's trying to do the right thing. And if you can get into the VA system, it's great. I get my health care at VA. I get congressional health care. Taxpayers pay for it. Thank you very much. But I go to VA. I go to VA for my health care because I want to sit in that waiting room for those 3 hours waiting for my prescription medicine, talking to other vets. Because then I get to pick up the phone and call the hospital director and say, what's going on? I just had a thing happen. I had my baby, and VA referred me to a civilian provider because, guess what? VA does not do obstetrics. And you know what? Like happened with my first daughter, I've almost gone into collections because VA is not paying the bill. And if I, a US senator, is having trouble getting my health care bill paid for by VA and I'm 100% disabled, what does that do to a 17-year-old with post-traumatic stress who's trying to get help. So we gotta fix this, but this is an ongoing thing, and it's why I do what I do, because I'm not gonna let my fellow vets fall through the cracks. But they do every single day, and I can't catch them enough.
And how would you rate this administration, the new administrator? He's only been on the job, Robert Wilkie, now a few weeks. But are you encouraged? Is he at least saying the right things, or is the administration putting the resources toward this, or starting to think about this, or?
Well, he's saying the right things. I spoke with him and had a meeting with him before his confirmation, and I voted for him. My question to him is, are you willing to get fired from your job to stand up and help veterans? Because that's what it's going to take.
And what did he say?
He said yes, so we'll see. Okay. So we'll see. Look, but this goes back to that disconnect. American people don't know what the cost of war is because we're disconnected from the guys that keep going over there, and we don't realize the cost of war is not $1 trillion for the war in Iraq. It's many more trillions because we have a debt to these veterans. They did not hesitate when we asked them to serve. They said, I will go. When we said, who will go? They said, I will go. But when they come forward and say, I need help, we often say, well, it's going to take 40 days for you to get a return phone call. That's not acceptable.
I'm going to turn to the audience for questions now. We just have a few moments for questions, and I'm afraid we may not get through all of you, so please be patient. Limit your question to one question, and please have a question mark at the end of it, or I will cut you off. Okay, please.
This is a lot of pressure. So I'm the adult daughter of a 4-tour veteran, and I really watched my father filter back, volunteer to go back. And you feel lucky that all he's struggling with is finding a job and PTSD, but how can we break down this the divide between civilians and the military families who are struggling every day? How can we convince people that they should hire them and not just vaguely, wave the flag and show us the yellow ribbons, but how can we get them to make sure that if they're able, that they can get jobs and that they can get the support that they need, and that the civilians can understand that there's however many thousands of these people coming home who need help and need jobs, and so that they don't filter back, so that we're not in this forever. Thank you.
I wrote a piece of legislation called the Troop Talent Act that's been partially implemented that requires the Pentagon to identify the civilian specialty for which, the civilian equivalent of the specialty for which the service member has, so that they know and give them the certifications for those jobs. An example, we talked about your doc, right? The Army version, an Army medic does not actually get an EMT license, so they could actually be doing battlefield medicine, literally things that a doctor would be doing because they're the only healthcare out in a fob, and they come home and they have to retake an EMT class, and then none of their time in combat counts. And then they lose out when they try to compete. And they're like, and these guys are like, WTF, I just been sewing my buddies together and sticking IVs in them and keeping them alive. What do you mean I got to go sit through a class on how to do CPR? And you know what they do? They get pissed off and they turn around and they walk away because they don't have the patience for it. And so I'm trying to do this, and I met with Northrop Grumman, and we're trying. It's a slow process, and we're going to keep at it. And the more veterans we get into office, the more we can get people working on this.
Hi, my name's Evan Hayes. I'm a sophomore at George Washington University studying security policy, so I was going to ask a sort of niche question. We look at all of these wars, and one of the main issues that we see is just the fact that there are loads of weapons laying around. I mean, a lot of them are ex-Soviet weapons. A lot of them are supplied by the United States. So I'm just wondering, in the opinion of you all who've done a lot of tireless advocacy, who have done a lot to help us understand these wars, how can we get the military aspects of a conflict out of these conflict zones? Because you can provide infrastructure for politically solving the social cleavages in a place like Iraq or in a place like in Afghanistan, but as long as these weapons are sitting around there, conflict is probably going to follow. So I'm just wondering, what do you all think about that sort of particular issue in the context of these wars?
Chris?
Yeah, I knew you were going to say right now.
Yeah. This man knows more about weapons. I mean, author of the gun as well.
The first step is probably acknowledging that weapons last longer than wars. Small arms last several decades, minimally. Sometimes we see them even almost 100 years old and still in active use in combat, like the old Lee Enfield rifles that are in Afghanistan and Iraq and have shot many a Western soldier or civilian. The first step is recognizing that handing out weapons as a short-term solution to some security partnership is probably building a long-term problem. As long as we keep pumping weapons into these places, I think we're hardwiring them for long-term conflict. I mean, again, I'm the skeptic and the pessimist in almost every conversation, but I really passionately believe this. We do not seem to have much capacity for learning as a country, and we find it easier to partner up with someone and give them weapons for ambition that might be only a year or 2 or 3. And almost all of those weapons, and that's unfair, a large fraction of those weapons almost immediately disappear and are used for crimes or against us. So that's the first step. Longer term is more complicated, and I don't want to take up a lot of the time, but it involves a willingness to collect and destroy the weapons, which gets into a big political football in the United States.
Hi, thank you so much. This is really moving and wonderful, everything that you've all done. My name is Samantha Carlin. I am a master's student, or got a master's from the Fletcher School of Diplomacy. So my question actually relates to diplomacy. What troubles me, having relationships with people in the military, is seeing a military budget that is so enormous, and then a State Department budget and USAID budget that is so small. And I think diplomacy is the first line of combat, and then compounded with, right now with this administration, all these positions, ambassador positions unappointed. I see droves of my fellow Fletcher people who are incredible negotiators and could be, solving world peace working at REI until 2020. How do we deal with that mismatch of budgets? Because now we have a ton of military who are trying to do post-conflict work that humanitarian people are trained to do, but then there's no budget for them to actually go do that type of humanitarian work.
We need to decide what we want to happen in Afghanistan. Do we want to be there at war indefinitely with no off-ramp? Because if that's the case, then we have the right budget for it right now. Right? We declared war on terror, which is one of my staff member calls. It's not actually a war on anything, it's a war on a feeling. It's a war on an adjective. So how do you come to an end in that? What is the mission? And we think that, and look, the men and women in uniform do the job that they're told to do. Take that bridge, hold that hill, conduct that ambush, do whatever that is. And we as a country have not told them what that mission is in Afghanistan. And that's the problem, right? If it's nation building, then we're putting money in the wrong place and we're sending over the wrong people. So we have to decide as a country, what do we want? Afghanistan, according to the same really smart staff member who's way smarter than me, he calls it the cemetery of civilizations. It's where the British lost, it's where the Russians were crushed, it's where Americans are now stuck in a morass. And if that's what we want to do forever, then we have the right budget for it. And we continue to put, when we get into a place where we don't like how big the budget looks of the military, we then go to OCO funding, which is Overseas Contingency Operations, and we just create this slush fund that we throw money in that. Then we have the right budget for where we are, because nobody in Congress has made the decision to say what we want in Afghanistan, what we want in Iraq, what that end state is, and then stick by it. There's no off-ramp. And if there's no off-ramp, you're just going in a circle. And who goes in the circle? The same people who gets deployed, come home, deployed, come home, deployed, come home. So to answer your question, me and my colleagues and the person in the White House has to decide, okay, it's time to move away from that, and we're going to engage with something other than M4s and mortars and attack aircraft. But until we make that decision, and if the American people go out and vote and make that decision, this is where we are.
Thank you.
Sure.
Good evening. My name is Michael McHenry, and I need to ask for the advice of each of the panelists, please. I served for 28 years in the Central Intelligence Agency, including multiple deployments and returns to both Iraq and Afghanistan. I first came down with, was first diagnosed with post-traumatic stress in 1991 after having been in Kuwait for the invasion by the Iraqis. My question for each of the members of the panel is, what do I say to myself and what do I say to my colleagues who, nominally civilians, we weren't veterans per se, but we served. And we were out there, we got shot at, we shot back. I know 3 people who were killed. And what do you say to people like me about what we should do next and how we should view our own service? Thank you.
And thank you for your service. Thank you very much. Very early on in the creation of TAPS, we immediately embraced all those who are serving in defense of freedom, and that includes CIA, NSA, State Department. I served, was mobilized after 9/11, and then went into a political appointment as the White House liaison to the Department of Veterans Affairs, and from there volunteered to go to Iraq, not in my reserve capacity, but as a Department of the Army civilian. So spent a year in Baghdad working with the Coalition Provisional Authority there, but seeing 1,400 of my colleagues who were there without, in this weird temp status. But wow, we were meeting the mission. And so it's very important that we include everyone and acknowledge every service given to this country. So thank you for raising that.
Sure.
Dave Steigman, retired U.S. Naval Reserve, currently working Communications, Veterans Affairs. To those of you who have covered, and I give a shout out to the Guard and Reserve, have a warm part of me. What sort of differences have you noticed when Guard and Reserve come home as opposed to active? Active will come home to a major base, to all the support service. Guard will come home, and sometimes even if they've just been deployed to another part of the U.S. and you find a job that is unsympathetic, demobilized out of your reserve center and no support services, you're back at home. Have you noticed any difference in your coverage, and to those, Senator, ma'am, in any programs being done to help veterans and reserve more? Thank you.
Thank you. So there's more work that's being done. I was a state director of Veterans Affairs. One of my frustrations working as a state, at the state agency director was the fact that I would actually get service members coming home and I would never be told that they were coming home. And so I wasn't able to welcome them back. And so unfortunately, it's a state by state what's available, but those networks are growing. There's a National Association of State Directors for Veterans Affairs that is doing a lot of really good work in this field. And I do know that the National Guard, I'm not as familiar with the reserve forces, but the National Guard is doing a much, much better job of bringing people back and having that safety net, because there you're belonging to your local armory, you're part of that same group, and those support services are there. But it is still very much piecemeal. Again, this is part of that. What do we do to take care of veterans for the rest of their lives, make sure they get the jobs, their families are supported. It's a work in progress is the best thing that I can say.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but I wanted to thank each of the panelists tonight for their thoughts, and I want to thank you, the audience, for being such an engaging group. Thank you very much, and good evening.
Thank you.